be responsible because of instability in Ecuador, where 2 weeks ago there was a mass killing in a jail and they killed over 60 inmates in Ecuador. Another ally of the United States. These are the few countries that the Secretary of State of the United States has visited in this hemisphere. So we're supposed to be a bad influence. We know that we have some influence. We are an example of a country that is stubborn in saying that we have a right to self-determination and to determine what goes on in our country. And we do not apologize for that. We cannot shy away from that. We are an example that a country, a poor country, and of course, certainly a wealthy country, can guarantee health services for all for free and of quality. And again, we're not going to apologize for that. We know that we're an example of a country whose national budget, the greatest chunk of it, goes to education, in greater terms than any country in the hemisphere. And again, we know that's a bad example. We know that it is a bad example that we refuse to allow transnational corporation or transnational capital to be the owners of this country. That we threw them away 60 years ago. And today we allow foreign capital. We are ready to engage with transnational corporations for the development of Cuba, for the well-being of our people, but in terms that ensure the rights of the Cuban population. And that is a bad example. We are not in bed with transnational capital, and that is, in our hemisphere, a unwanted example. And if that is the pretext, then it's true, but not in the way it is presented, and not in the way it is being relayed to the people in the United States. Another pretext is that the Cuban government is in conflict with its society, with our youth, with our artists, with our intellectuals, with our religious organizations, with women, with Cubans of an African origin, which is a very difficult equation because all of us, one way or another, are descendants of Africans. In some cases, it is more evident. In some cases, it is more subtle. But the great majority of Cubans have some percentage of African blood, is what we are. But beyond that, which is more important, the African influence is in our brain, is in our sentiment, in what we eat, in how we dress, in how we walk, in how we talk. And I say this now, for me that was a strange idea, but I served 4 years as ambassador in South Africa. And there I learned about this, because the racial issue is so sensitive in South Africa. It was South Africans who had studied in Cuba who educated me this. You don't notice it, but for us it was remarkable that regardless of how you look on your outside, in Cuba you are the same, an integrated society. In South Africa, everything depends on the color of your skin or your origin. But that is another element that is being introduced in the narrative against Cuba. And one last one, of many, but the major one, is that the economic blockade is not the true problem of Cuba. That truly, Cuba's economic limitations are basically a result of Cuba's mismanagement or the fact that we have a socialist system in our country. And this is said, of course, without any evidence whatsoever. One can simply ask the question, what would be the fate of the economy of any state of the United States, let's say California, if the rest of the states, if the state of Texas were to cut its economic ties with the state of California? Or what would be the fate of the state of Florida if the rest of the states of the United States were to cut and to punish and to sanction the state of Florida as the United States sanctions Cuba? What would be the fate of the economy of Canada if the United States were to say we're going to cut 15% of our economic ties? Canada is a developed country, fully industrialized, high standards of living. What would be the impact for Mexico, which is a huge country, huge economy compared to Cuba? What would be the impact for Spain if the United States were to say we're going to cut our economic ties? Once those economies start to have problems, can you blame it because there were mistaken economic policies in those countries? Yet this is repeated time after time, and it's being induced through digital networks, even in the Cuban population, by sophisticated and well-financed machineries in the United States. But those of you that have visited Cuba in the past, if you had visited Cuba between 2012 and 2018, you could ask yourself, was there or was there not an improvement in the Cuban economy?
Yeah.
Was there or was there not an improvement in the standard of living of the Cuban population?
Yeah.
You could see it in the streets. And that was with the very, very limited exceptions that the Obama government introduced to the economic blockade. Now, since 2017, with the introduction of new economic coercive measures by the Trump government, plus the addition of COVID and the strengthening of the blockade during COVID, there is, of course, and naturally, a depression in the Cuban economy. Life today is not better than it was 5 years ago. But you can ask that question to anyone who visited Cuba then. You can ask it to members of Congress in the United States. You can ask it to members of the government in the United States. Was there or was there not an improvement in the economy of Cuba once the US government decided to introduce just limited exceptions to the economic blockade? And was there or was there not a step back once the US reintroduced new economic coercive measures in Cuba? Those questions can defeat easily the notion that the economic blockade truly has no impact on the Cuban economy. And then there's a question: if it has no impact, then why apply it? Why have you needed for 60 years the effort to try to make Cuba unsuccessful? Now today, we can tell you that in spite of our limitations, and in spite of the continued economic blockade, the Cuban economy is viable. It can continue to succeed with many more difficulties than if the economic blockade was not there. With many more difficulties if there's no easing whatsoever, if there are no exceptions whatsoever in the economic blockade, because it's very overwhelming. And it has impact not only in the relationship between Cuba and the United States, it has an impact in our relationship with the rest of the world. There's a persecution of Cuban financial transactions anywhere in the world. The amount of banks from any country, regardless of the relationship of that country's government with Cuba, are limited. Most are fearful. If they have business in the United States, they don't want to do business with Cuba. They fear the real threat of the US government. And therefore, it is very difficult for us today to ensure financing to do trade. It is very difficult to find ships to carry goods to Cuba. It is very difficult to find companies that are ready to run the risk of being punished by the US if they do business with Cuba. That's our reality today. And that increases the cost of us doing business anywhere around the world. It delays shipments. And therefore it delays the goods or the materials that we need for our industry. It delays the services that we need to provide for our population. And there's an impact in everyday life. From buying the basic drugs that you need for health, for the elderly, for chronic diseases, to the equipment that and the material that you might need in a hospital to ensure surgery, to ensure basic services, to electricity, to the supply of water, to transportation, and to the basic goods that Cubans need for everyday life, including food. It has an impact on everything. But again, we believe that overcoming the COVID is a major step for us, because it will ensure us to have the legitimate income that we need from tourism, from other services, from people traveling to Cuba. And that in spite of all the burdens that we have and all the hurdles being put by the US, we believe that our economy is viable in a humble way. We're not a wealthy country. We're not a European country, but that basic needs in a dignified manner for the people of Cuba can be ensured. Now, why does the US get away with doing all this against Cuba? And worst of all, of doing it on behalf of Americans, doing it on your behalf, doing it on behalf of people of Cuban origin that live in the United States. And some might agree with them, but not all of them. Yet, on behalf of all of them, you're doing this. To some extent, it is linked to the characteristics and the limitations of the US political system, in which a group of politicians, members of Congress, can get away with monopolizing an issue, which is the case of Cuba, tying it to the electoral importance of one state, the state of Florida, and therefore hijacking a policy on their behalf, and providing a service to big transnational capital in the US that thinks that Cuba certainly is a bad example. And they are not only the promoters of this policy, but they are instruments of this policy for greater powers in the US. They are capable of reaching out to members of Congress, and the government, the administration is part of this. They brief members of Congress. They have meetings, the State Department. They tell them Cuba is a failed state, and they explain why. They say Cuba is a bad influence and a dangerous influence in our hemisphere. It is an advanced position of the interest of Russia, China, North Korea, Iran. Cuba is like a military base of all those interests in the Caribbean that poses a major threat to the United States. That the people in Cuba are suffering because of the mistaken policies of the government. That there's a caste in Cuba formed by the people of the government, us, that are very rich and very wealthy, and we keep our people subjugated because of that. And many members of Congress, in the absence of an alternative narrative, believe so. When our embassy meets them, they say, well, the people that have come to me to talk about Cuba tell me that you're a failed state, that you're carrying out a very bad influence in Latin America, that you have Russian troops and Chinese intelligence officers and Iranian terrorists in Cuba that are a threat to the United States. Members of Congress that are supposed to be well educated and informed tell us that. And many tell us that honestly and naively, because it's what they're being told, again, in the absence of an alternative narrative. That is why for us, what you're doing is so important. Coming to Cuba, visiting Cuba, going around Cuba to the extent which is possible, talking to people in the street, learning by yourselves, and hopefully that you go back to your communities and you share what you have seen, not what you're being told, but what you have seen. Better off if what you share with the communities is shared with whoever represents you in Congress, or alleges that represents you in Congress, or people who are vocal in the United States, so that the narrative that is being portrayed about Cuba cannot be easily induced into the minds of the Americans. And people can learn from themselves. Our wish would be to have thousands, hundreds of thousands of Americans coming to see Cuba by themselves, talking to us, criticizing us, finding our flaws, sharing an alternative paradigm so that we can listen. How does it happen in the US? How do you solve your problems? What have you seen in other parts of the world that you think would be useful in Cuba? Sharing your spiritual beliefs that you believe that we should take into account. That is what we welcome. And our hope would be that caravans like this one, or different trips or groups like this, can continue to come and increase in the amount that come. If each one of you is capable of sharing and telling your friend, your neighbor, your colleague, your comrade, your religious partner, whoever, I went to Cuba, you should go. Try it. You'll learn something. It will be an interesting experience. That would be a great contribution to what I think we come to believe. Because the people of the United States and the people of Cuba should have the opportunity to share openly, to share our values, to share our disagreements and alternative approaches to life, to learn from each other, and to engage without the imposition of the US government, which is in the middle. It's an obstacle for the relationship between the people of the United States and the people of Cuba. So that we can share more in arts, in culture, in scientific research, in education, in training, in sharing skills, in religious cooperation and engagement. That's the kind of link that our two nations should have. Cuba, a small, humble nation, the United States, a big partner, but we can share. The history of our two countries is of learning from each other. There's mutual influence in spite of the political animosity of over 200 years. And we hope, again, that initiatives like this one can grow in the United States and that it can become not the exception, but the norm of Americans traveling over, sharing with us, and us sharing with Americans of different walks of life that can engage with us and teach us. I would like to, perhaps we can have a Q&A if you have questions. But before that, I would like to convey our profound appreciation for what many of you do. The many cities in the United States have approved resolutions asking the government for engagement with Cuba. And even though it is largely ignored, it is a huge contribution. It teaches people. We'd like to also express our immense appreciation for the your effort in bringing goods to Cuba. Not so much because of its material impact, which is important, but because of the gesture. The gesture of solidarity that our people needs to see. We don't want the people of Cuba to identify the United States as an enemy. It shouldn't be that way. Because the majority of Americans don't regard themselves as enemies of Cuba. We know that. And gestures like yours help for that to happen. And help Americans to see that there's an alternative. That there's no right for the government to deprive Americans from the right to travel to Cuba. It is a crime in the United States to be a tourist in Cuba. For you to come, you have to find subterfuge to do it. This is one. You come in a caravan because there's an exchange allowed by a license, but you need permission. As you need permission of the government to send Cuban medicines to Cuba. As you need permission from the US government to send water to Cuba. Or to send oxygen to Cuba. It is prohibited by law. You need a license from the Commerce and the Treasury Departments to provide oxygen to Cuba. To provide water, bottled water to Cuba. You need a license because it's prohibited by law. So again, our immense appreciation for your effort, for what you do, for Pastor for Peace, but that I think is a given. And perhaps we can engage in questions. I'm joined by people from our office here that if I don't have the answer, they could help with whatever we're talking.